Hello, adventurers, pilgrims, myth makers, and cosmonauts. If you have found this space station, you must be interested in history, herstory, mystery, and bees. Thank you for showing up, suiting up, and traveling with us as we explore the world of bees. From the time they arrived on a shooting star to a recent journey they took to outer space. I'm Laura Bee, and my fellow cosmonaut and explorer is Andrew Gough. Today we're going to introduce ourselves and maybe talk a little bit about how we came into talking about bees. Thanks for joining us. I'm Laura Bee from Southern Oregon.
And I'm Andrew Gough from London, England.
And we're doing our podcast, Bees in Space. And today we're going to just introduce ourselves and talk about why this topic.
Don't you just love the whole concept of bees in space? I mean, isn't it just fresh? And we love everything about the honeybee. We love everything about the sacred feminine, but it's kind of been done a lot. But bees in space just opens up a whole new universe of possibilities, right?
Right. Well, especially because bees come from space. And according to all the ancient legends out there, so many ancient legends talk about bees coming from outer space. And it's really strange that here, sort of like at the tail end of the snap around the edge of patriarchy, that we actually sent bees back to outer space on a rocket ship recently.
There's some irony in that. I think some serendipity for sure. Well,
Yeah.
listen, I can't wait. And this has not been rehearsed. I can't wait to hear how you got into bees. I have a sense that it's going to be quite profound. Mine was almost kind of accidental, but I'm really grateful for the fact that I have. Shall we just take turns kicking off on how we got into this amazing subject?
Yeah, and this is a multi-part podcast, so we're going to be revealing these mysteries to you piece by piece by piece. And we just wanted to set up our little journey so you know who you're journeying with and how we got here. And today we're just going to do sort of a partial introduction, and then we'll begin doing our travel log next time. So go ahead, Andrew, share your screen and let's see more about you.
I'd like to just kick off with the obligatory how it began and how it's going. I mean, it's not every day that you meet somebody who is really passionate and all consumed about the sacredness of the honeybee, and that's not something that you find in most people. So, for me, I mean, I have a passion for travel, and my father was a pilot for TWA, and we always had these free passes, so we can fly anywhere as long as you wait and don't mind getting on the plane last for free, and that really spawned my sort of enthusiasm to go to obscure places. Here I'm in Bhutan, I'm in India, and I love India. I'm passionate about India. And these guys, you go there and, you smoke with these guys, you do dope with these guys, you get high with these guys, you just commune with them. And I did a lot of that kind of experience. Here I am in South America. I grew up in Chicago, a great sort of hub for traveling. But it was, despite the cool places I was going, I didn't really have a calling. I didn't really know what I was supposed to be into and researching. I wasn't writing. I wasn't on a path. And I remember getting divorced and leaving Chicago and moving to north to Milwaukee, and walking into a bookstore and just standing there and looking around and wondering, what should I read about? What should I investigate? And literally a book fell off the stand that was about archaeology, and it kind of got me going, or at least it was the first step. And then I moved to the UK, and it just seemed like things really accelerated, because as amazing as Chicago was, and now in hindsight, there's a lot of ancient places around the Midwest for sure. England is just full of ancient places. The UK, every turn, there's another amazing. Here's a Celtic cross in the Isle of Iona in Scotland. You know, I'm probably the only person who will admit to having almost smashed the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull to bits. Oh. I went up to Scotland to a conference, and at lunchtime, you could go visit the crystal skull. And I went to visit the crystal skull, and I had my big paparazzi lens, and I put the wide angle on, and I kneeled down on the table next to it that it was sitting on, and I wanted to take this really great picture, but my knee caught the tablecloth, and the skull went flying in the air. And I'll never forget it, because I just ran and dove like in slow motion, and I caught it with my outstretched hand. I put it back on the table, and I nodded to the journalist from the Edinburgh Sentinel to take the photo, and I put my face down, and that's that photo there.
Every time you tell that story, it freaks me out. And I've heard that story several times, and it always elicits the same, just amazing.
I got so bollocked by Bill for having touched it, for having almost destroyed it, and that would have been bad karma, certainly. And I got really into the megalithic. Here's this fertility stone in Cornwall and Land's End, and on the other side, I'm in Aragon, Spain, looking at where allegedly the Holy Grail was kept in one of the great Grail castles.
Can you go back a second, Andrew?
Yeah,
you know that Holy Stone, and this is for the listeners, is just a hint for future. That's almost like the inverse of the libation bowl, like in a way, like it's, the libation bowl is the cradle, and this is, the pushing through, like it represents that transitional liminal space. I just think this is going to be interesting to refer to when we get to our, that work in the future. So let's hold that slide in the thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I can see that. I could absolutely see that. And the viewers, you're probably asking, well, why are we talking about Renly Chateau? What is that? What does that have to do with me? I slowly got into this mystery that was spawned with the bestseller, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. And you can see me with Henry Lincoln here. The story of Renly Chateau, a priest. It's 1891. He's in the middle of nowhere in the south of France, and he's renovating his church, and he knocks over a pillar. It has these ancient scrolls. Nobody can decipher them. And the bishop says, well, you're going to have to go to Paris to Saint Sulpice, and they'll help you interpret this. And he does, and he comes back, and he's changed. He's wealthy. He drinks a lot. He's disturbed. He renovates his village to be everything to do with Mary Magdalene. And so I got consumed with Mary Magdalene and the goddess. And here's the Tower of the Magdala, which has 22 steps. Her feast day is the 22nd of July. 22 steps that lead up to one window that points at 22 degrees to an ancient burial grotto whose place name is the burial site of Mary Magdalene. And you can see there's still sort of a shape of where a body was. And so I would go to where history says she's buried further down the coast in France. And that led me to another woman who is just absolutely incredible, Patrice Chaplin, married Charlie Chaplin's son, and Hollywood films with Andy Garcia and Isabella Rossini have been made about her books. She's really accomplished, and she came out of nowhere and said, the mystery of Renly Chateau and what this priest discovered has nothing really to do with Renly Chateau or the priest so much as it does Girona in Catalan. And there was a woman involved who was the real source of this mystery. And I got very consumed with Patrice and this gentleman, Jose Therese, who was the keeper of these secrets. And it took me on a journey to Girona several times with Patrice. And her book, City of Secrets, that talks about all this, highlights this Kabbalist who I met when Patrice was kind enough to introduce me. And we just gelled instantly. I've never gelled with someone so quickly in my life and went so deep into just bizarre esoteric subjects. Within 60 seconds of meeting her, we're talking about the different types of jed pillars. Can
you just kind of like in a sentence or two describe what a Kabbalist is?
A Kabbalist is somebody who is applying ancient methods of interpreting everything, numerology, symbolism, and looking for the significance of all of that in everyday life, but also in esoteric literature and concepts. It's you could say Jewish and ancient Jewish in origin, and Girona was one of the places where it really thrived. And this woman taught Salvador Dali and John Cocteau. John Cocteau is allegedly one of the last grand masters of the Priory of Zion, and he, an artist whose work is just amazing. There's a piece of his work in London that is incredible. It insinuates that it wasn't Jesus Christ who died on the cross. And in fact, he didn't die on the cross. And it's just really heretical. But so she taught him and she taught Salvador Dali. And you have to be asked to study with her. You can't ask her. So I was blown away when she asked me to study. And I said, yeah, great. When do we start? So a few months later, I flew back down to Girona and we went to her home that you see here, and went out in the balcony, and we were going to study these ancient scrolls per my request. And while we're having breakfast, these bees are flying around our breakfast table. And we got to talking about bees, and that day and the following day and the following day, and for years thereafter, she taught me so much about the sacredness of bees. And I've written now so much about bees, but I cannot write about the other 80% that she taught me because it's just too weird. It's too esoteric. I don't know how to break it down and communicate it. And she was a tough taskmaster. If I wanted to make a phone call or go to the bathroom, and you got a fire hose of information and you had to take it until she was done.
Wow, nice.
And that, how did I get started and how it's going? Thanks to Ingrid. I put the high level stuff into a trilogy of articles about the bees, and then continued to write a whole lot more about them from all sorts of different perspectives. So, I came to be into everything about the sacredness of bees and the divine feminine quite by accident. It wasn't ordained, and it's one of those pleasant accidents that I feel very grateful to have had the opportunity to experience. So that's how I got into bees.
Or was it ordained?
Or was it ordained? Great point. Yeah.
On personal culture, So it was really neat to look at it with fresh eyes and sort of think, how did I get here? And when you were talking before, I was like, I'm always intimidated by scholarship. And I think many people are. I mean, I'm educated. I have my bachelor's degree and I've done a lot of schooling outside of that as well. But but what you're talking about, like studying with this master and like having these gurus and teachers and going to India and these places, it's just like, that kind of discipline and stamina is just like really impressive to me. But it's very inspiring. But I have a little bit of a different story in that my knowledge is coming from more of a embodiment. Like I'm learning with my body some of these truths. Anyway, let's start from the beginning. My mother told me I was conceived on the banks of the Dead Sea, and this is a picture of the Dead Sea. And what's really what's really fascinating about that is it's the lowest place on the planet, and it's pristine. It's pure. It's a pure crystalline environment, so and she said that the sea there was very buoyant, and it was so relaxing and buoyant, and we know that the minerals are really good for your skin. And so I thought, oh, what a beautiful story. She was only 19 when she had me, so she was 18. And she was an orphan, and she was not an orphan. She was an 18-year-old. Her mother had died, and she was married to my father, and traveling around. They were hitchhiking as part of the whole European thing in the 60s, right? The hippies would go to the Middle East and the Afghanistan. My father went to Afghanistan. And anyway, so they were part of that Marrakesh Express, part of my family went to Morocco too. So it was like this family. Nice. Yeah, this real family. My family's very, very big on travel. So, and while my mother was there, she was very, of course, being so young, she was probably scared to be pregnant, but she said that a horse spoke to her and said that she would have a very special child. And so that was the first she knew of me was that, and she was in Israel, and she had seen this horse, a wild white stallion, speaking to her with her mind. And this is important to me because I am in love with animals, and I want to become, I feel like I communicate with animals. I'm an animal communicator. I mean, we all are, but I want to learn more and more and more about nature and listening to her. So to me, it's really important that part of my story, that an animal told her that she was pregnant with me. So that's amazing. Yeah. So some other interesting things. So she never told anybody that she was pregnant with me, and they were hungry, and she was skinny, and I was born really tiny, but they traveled from Israel and Jordan to Italy, and they were hitchhiking from southern Italy with this couple that were not married, but they were having an affair. They were married to other people, or he was married to somebody else, and her name was Laura, and they only had 1 week a year where they could be together because he was married to somebody else. So they were driving from southern Italy to Milan, and they bought my mother clothes and food. And this woman said to my mother, "You're pregnant, aren't you?" And she said, "Yes." And so gave her food and made sure she was doing good. And then, so I was named after her. So the man kept saying, "Laura, mi amore." So my first name is from this Italian, which is the source of the name Laura, from laurel, which is from the crown of laurels, which comes from this even pre-Greco-Roman bee priestess symbol.
That's so cool.
I know. It's so then a little bit beyond. I mean, I'm a very humble childhood. This is, of course, this is all in retrospect, finding out about myself. My last name is Ferguson. And you can see in that image, it's a Scottish name. This is with 2 S's, but all of the Fergusons our logo or our crest is a bee on a thistle, and the Latin means, usually they say we kill or we're the strongest or something, but ours says dulcius ex asperis, which means sweeter after difficulty. So it's kind of story of my life. If you barrel through, so sweetness will come, and to find sweetness from that thistle. Well, it turns out the Fergusons may have been this part of this French movement that into there that brought beekeeping from France.
Wow.
Yes. And this is a very like little tiny thread that I teased out of it because I had to know why the bee, why the honeybee. And they may have been this wisdom holder. Fergus is the god of the origin god of Scotland. And his wife is Philidius, who is the equivalent of Artemis. She is the mother of all the animals. Did not know this until I was an adult. And it all will make sense to our listeners later. Some of these things that I'm talking about. I was born under the sign of Leo, and then my birthday is actually on Lammas Eve. So it's actually one of the sacred days of the pagan calendar. So it's just kind of interesting that when I dissected on my name, that this, and my birth story and everything, it's just kind of is interesting. This is my father. Of course, he was just fresh back he's a military man. And he did a lot of work. He was a captain, and he did a lot of work in the military. And there's my mother, very young. She's only 20 there, and I look just like her.
You do?
Yeah, I know. And so that's me as just a fat little baby. And I'm the oldest of 6 children, with 2 sisters with her and 3 brothers in common with him. So her father was actually, and it's a sad story, at the beginning of World War I, he was sold into the Merchant Marines. So his family, there was 12 children, and they were very, very, very poor in Europe. They sold him as a cabin boy. So I don't know what kind of things that meant, but I know that he was a master rigger, and he was sailing tall ships, and he was on, and it may have even been this particular ship. This is he was on the last sailing ship to go around the Horn of Africa, and he was a rigger. So this is the kind of ship, if not the ship, that he was on as his last, but he was a merchant marine all the way to the end. And I remember, so the traveling thing is in my blood there as well, but I also remember Bees in Space laying on the floor in his living room, looking at his coin collection from all over the world and watching the lunar landing.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember watching it, laying on the floor and watching on the little bubble TV. So anyway, my son here is also a master sailor, and he took to rigging, and he was able to go on a tall ship. So this is my son. So that's, the bloodline goes through, and he is also an animal communicator. So here's my father. It's a very blurry picture, but this is my father and one of my brothers, and he's passed. And this is his mother, and she traveled. She even had lovers in Morocco into her 80s, maybe even 90s. And then my grandfather, he told me that we were Cherokee. My rest of my family will deny it as till the cows come home, but he said that we were Cherokee people. And he told me a lot of stories of his life as a world traveler as well. He mapped Guam. He was part of a military contingent that mapped Guam. He also rode a camel in the 90s, when he was in his 90s in Egypt, and he died at 108. So we have a lot of really cool family stories. He was a cowboy that brought cattle from Texas to Chicago when he was 16.
That's incredible.
I know. So I got to meet him, and he really inspired me, of course, with his stories and I always believed when he told me we were Cherokee, I was like, no way, I knew it. And I was only like maybe 12 when I met him. And anyway, that kind of figures into my story, even though my family denies it. They say, no, you're not. But he told me we were. So long story short, my mother and father were disconnected for a long time. And after my father remarried, we went to live with him. And this was the age I discovered bees. And in this picture is actually Christmas morning, and I'm getting a playhouse. And up until then, I had a very, very poor upbringing. So the idea of a playhouse is just like the most amazing thing. And also around this time, same age, we went to a place called OMSI, which is the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry. And this is a picture in the 70s. I swear this could have been our van, but except we had VW vans, but that era. Anyway, this was the planetarium, and my family, and it was quite a very fancy thing that we had it in Portland. And my family wanted to go look at the stars. And I said, well, I want to look at the bees. And I didn't want to leave the observation hive. This is not the observation hive of the day, but it's one very similar in my memory. And when I left, when they were pulling me away to go look at the stars, I hugged the hive and I heard the sound, and tears came to my eyes, and the warmth of the hive. It was a profound experience, probably my first real spiritual experience. And I fell in love, and I knew I was going to be a beekeeper someday. So
that's so interesting, because bees unjustifiably have, we've been conditioned to fear them, and you would never hug them. You would run from them, but you hug them.
I know, it was my nature. It was like something in my nature heard. And when I felt the warmth it was like my mother's sound. I mean, there was something, I want to cry how much I loved them from that moment. I mean, I loved them and never really, I just loved them. But I was like that. So I went to St. Francis of Assisi. So I was raised for some time to be Catholic, but I had a long history of, I would just wander by a Foursquare Baptist church, and they had Sunday school. And so I'd be like, I love school. I love God. I want to go to Sunday. And I would just go to Foursquare Baptist church, or when I was 16, eat with the, Krishnas down at the square. I mean, I loved religion. And this prayer here for St. Francis is one that always, is kind of became my code. But the best thing about St. Francis was his animals. And so at our church, we got to do animal parades and things like that to bless the animals. So it figured I was super into nature. So I was also really always in trouble because I was a big backtalker. And so I got into my dad's library, and I read Spindhorn, right? Up here is the Spindhorn Garden. I read every National Geographic. I read such crazy, everything from the 70s, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you name it. This one, Viktor E. Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, The Hobbit, so I loved fantasy. I loved science fiction. And then my mother wanted to be a nun, so she collected books and magazines on saints. So I read all of those. And so I learned all about this spiritual devotion and what people did. I learned about the Greek myths, was fascinated with that. And then, of course, those shows, remember those shows, Roots and the Holocaust? They came on. And so I really learned some deep, terrible stories about our humanity. I also was a child in the Vietnam era. So as you were, how much we were affected by that, especially probably being having pilots around you, probably had a fair amount of survivors. And my uncle was PTSD survivor, right? So that was a big thing, because we were hearing stories back then about terrible, terrible, terrible things, and then of course that spawned all the serial killers, which you would think, why is she mentioning it? It's because I lived as a girl in the 1970s on the West Coast under the constant fear of that. And it was a femicidal environment. So I knew that women, and then learning about Vietnam and learning about the Holocaust and these kinds of things really deeply affected the way that I saw the world, because that was out there. And it was also Roe versus Wade. So there was this feminism, this whole feminism that was uprising in my family and in the world around me on the West Coast. So, and then of course there's the Rajneeshis. They were everywhere when I was in high school. I mean, you would see people in orange all over the place. So I had this sense of what is a cult. And, I learned a lot about, because I was so interested in religions, and we had Jonestown and all these other major cult happenings. So I share this because at that time, I'm also learning about God. And so I'm learning about suffering, great suffering and fear and things, but I'm also learning about God and fantasy and all these different ways people change their landscape and the sacred things around the world. So it's a different sort of scholarship, right? And I was really fortunate to have a dad who was an absolute genius in a lot of ways. So the energy crisis, remember that. Yeah. So my dad worked at Bonneville Power Administration, and his job when the energy crisis happened, this lower left is the famous bus mall that we got, TriMet, and my dad knew about peak oil. That's what that little thing, the graph is. And then also he sat me down at 10 years old and told me about how all the icebergs were going to melt and everything. Like, so I had this sense of the apocalypse from the time I was 10 years old. And I knew that the world was suffering from then. I never had illusions about it. But he invented the energy buyback system. So this thing that's famous around the world, they use everywhere, solar farms everywhere. My dad and his friend John Laban sat in for months. They were holed up developing this system, and they developed it by creating solar panels. They were selling solar panels at the market, like on Saturday market, and they were working for Bonneville Power Administration. And he said, listen, I will work on your solar panel project. That's why he got hired there. And he developed this energy buyback system for the 5 tribes, 5 reservations. And he said, hey, we'll give the Native Americans these and they'll make money and sell it back to the grid. And he started that by thinking, how do I empower the Native peoples in our communities? And he developed that. Well, his company got, and our mayor got promoted to be the Secretary of Interior by Jimmy Carter. And my father's company got an award from Jimmy Carter for developing this program, and it became instituted across the world. So I had the sense very young that you can change things and that you can design new ideas, even though I didn't know that this was his creation until much later. But I also knew that the world was going to be, in big trouble, So part of where, so I was searching for God, right, this whole time. And one day I realized this piece on the left is another book that he had with all those photographs. It's Edward Curtis's, who took all the pictures on the Native Americans. It's this great, big, huge, gorgeous book, right? So he had that book. But this particular petroglyph was in the Columbia River Valley, beyond this where the light is shining. It's like way down in that. This is Columbia River Valley to the right. And so we, on the weekends, my dad he was a 3rd generation anthropologist. I'm a 4th generation anthropologist by way of study. So we go to this place. Well, this She Who Watches is probably, I'd say, as wide as I am tall, maybe 6 feet wide. So it's rather large. This was this story of the legend. And I was told this when I was a kid. Thank you, babe. Is this her real name, according to the Native people? I think it was a Chinook, but I can't remember. But the legend of the Sagalala, She Who Watches. Her name is She Who Watches. But she was the chief of everything in the region for a long, long time. And then Coyote came up to her. He had heard about her being, such a great leader in her area, said, hey, how are your people doing here? And they weren't yet people. They hadn't become people yet. She was just watching over everything and said, well, are they living well or are they sick? Are you a good chieftain or are you evil chieftain? And that's what Coyote asked. And she said, he asked her again, like, she said, I'm good. And he says, what kind of living do you give these people? She goes, well, I'm trying to teach them how to make nice houses. And I want to do this forever. I love this. I want to do this forever. And Coyote is a trickster. And he says, well, you know what? After a while, women aren't going to be chiefs anymore. So he turned her into this rock carving so that she could always watch her people. So I was raised thinking, knowing her, she was actually a bear. She's a bear goddess. And listeners will know that there's going to be a connection with bears later on. But I realized when I was a teenager skipping school and looking at this view, I realized I didn't have to look for God, that God was right here. So somewhere in this story, I knew it was the Native Americans' perspective on the planet was the story that I believed, that God was here on earth. And this was my proof right here, both of these ideas, And then in college, I came across Spiral Dance with Starhawk, and I began a journey of all of those 1980s and 90s religious festivals, pagan spiritual festivals that were pre-music festivals. And they were all about prayer and dowsing and energy and chakras and animal spirits and, women's empowerment and sexual liberation and all of these, and queer and transgender and all of these different, just cutting edge, wonderful, free, pre-rainbow family kind of, philosophies. And in Starhawk's book, she mentions the Melissae, the bee priestess. Of course, by now, this is also around the time at the end of my period here, I get pregnant, I have my son, and then I become a beekeeper a little bit later, and just a standard beekeeper. So I think, and then I'm going to fast forward because we'll talk about how the college developed. But my first workshop was with Andrew at Findhorn. And here we are with our little crew at Findhorn. This is a wonderful people. And it was such a great time that I had with you. And we're at this monastery with John, who was our focalizer, and many, many good friends from that. And so basically, I think what I really want to say is that I come to this work with the idea that animals are our family, and nature is our family, and the bees are speaking to us. And we'll share way more bee stories, and I'll share more about my bee stories. But that's kind of how I came to this place where I'm, something in me, like you, is just like, was born to it. And when I discovered it, it fit like a glove. And everybody that I meet, like you, who is in this, is part of my somehow soul family tribe. And so I think it's great because you're coming at it from a historical, and I think I'm coming at it from an embodiment historical. And I think both of us is such a great, interesting way that we're going to look at these things.
Yeah, I can't wait. I mean, that was an amazing story. There's so much there. I'm looking at that Columbia Valley relief, and it's a bear goddess. And I'm thinking Beowulf, Beowulf. There's so much that we need to talk about, and we will talk about. Mm-hmm. And that's what's so great about bees in space, is it just opens up the possibilities, and not even the possibilities, the realities. Because one of the things that you and I have spoken about a lot is that his story is full of lies. I'm sorry, it's just invention. Mm-hmm. So let's reinvent it the way we feel. Mm-hmm. And I emphasize the word feel is true, because what we've been told is a lie.
Exactly. And once we become clued in to the different ways people are tuning up history, we can start taking out notes, stripping notes, and getting to this basic information. And the great thing is because of your job and because of the way that you can live, you get to travel all over the world. So you have such great resources and photographs. You have thousands, don't you?
Yeah,
just thousands, yeah. Right? And I don't know, I love to interpret them and think about them and challenge them and see what's similar and see what's different. And you and I are going to be wrong probably quite a bit, but I think the important thing is how we're looking at ourselves. I think by looking at history, we're kind of able to talk about ourselves and maybe find new symbols to bring us hope and, something to aim for, So
yeah, and I'm talking to you today from London, but I also have a home in Istanbul, and I know Turkey is a place that's near and dear to your heart, and it is where one of the subjects that we're going to talk about very soon, mm-hmm. The world's oldest city, is, and how that relates to, in many ways, the birth of the sacred bee goddess.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And we're going to be both traveling there. Both of us have traveled to different parts. We're going to be visiting Çatalhöyük, Istanbul, Ephesus, probably, mm-hmm. and maybe even touching on some more modern places, but we're going to follow a meteorite.
Yeah. Meteorites are going to be key. And they're so important and so symbolic in so many different ways. And we all think about them. We all fear them. We all think of Armageddon, and we've seen the Bruce Willis films, uh-huh. But we're going to talk about meteorites in a completely different way, because mm-hmm. they have everything to do with the goddess.
Yeah, it made me think of wishing on a star or following a shooting star. We're actually going to be following a shooting star as she travels around on the planet from sacred place to sacred place. And I can't wait. It's going to be
And
fun.
as we move forward, we're going to have a live audience as well. So we're
Right.
going to have participation. We're going to have questions. We're going to have all the stuff that you'll be familiar with from your favorite podcast. So this is our introduction.
Right.
We're so excited to be kicking this off, and we hope that you join us on our journey.
To bees in space.
Bees in space.
Thank you, Andrew. We'll see you next time.
All right. See you soon, Laura.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.